Welcome to When Football Began Again, the podcast that takes a nostalgic look at the Premier League era. Hello and welcome to episode 10 of When Football Began Again, the podcast that takes a nostalgic look at the Premier League era. Today's episode is a deserted island matches special with author Rob Fletcher. He joins me to discuss his brand new book, 1992, The Birth of Modern Football. It is a brilliant book that breaks down all of the things that happened in 1992. Obviously, the Premier League started in 1992, which is of particular interest to this show, but it was not happening in isolation. There was a lot happening in world football, as we will cover in quite some detail with Rob very shortly. He also selects some of his memorable matches. He's a Middlesbrough fan, and 1996-97 features quite heavily Middlesbrough's, that iconic Middlesbrough team with Ravanelli and Juninho and the two cup finals and the relegation. It's a very, very interesting chat. Some really great matches that he picks, as well as talking in some depth about the UEFA Cup run a few years later as well. All of that to come very shortly. Just a quick word before we get going. As ever, if you are new here, thank you so much for finding me. I hope you enjoy the show. If you are returning and you've maybe listened to a few of these, please do me a huge favour. Make sure you're subscribing wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. That really, really helps. Leave a like, give it a share, let people who you think might enjoy this show know about it. It just helps me to reach more people. This is hopefully fantastic free content that you're enjoying, and it just encourages me to keep on making it. I have got so many plans ahead with this show, so please keep sharing it, spread the word for me, and let's find even more people. Speaking of which, we actually reached the podcast football charts this week. We were 120th in the Apple Football Podcast, above Ben Foster's podcast for a little bit. New Wrexham goalkeeper Ben Foster. And 65th in the Norwegian football charts. Hello, if you are listening in Norway. Thank you so much. It's a little while before we find out who the greatest Premier League Norwegian player is. I've got a feeling who might win that, but we're doing them in alphabetical order. So stay tuned. I'll see you in about another 150 episodes. So let's kick things off then. Rob Fletcher's Deserted Island Matches. A fascinating chat with Rob. Really, really lovely guy. Some really interesting matches and fantastic insight into why 1992 was such a seismic year, both for English football, but also football around the world. Let's get on with it. Joining us today to discuss the fantastic new book, 1992, The Birth of Modern Football, and also to put some matches onto a deserted island, it's Rob Fletcher. Rob, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Carl. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about a bit about the borough and a bit about the book.
Exactly. Well, the book is out right now as we release this. So I'm looking forward to finding out a lot more about that as well. Before we deep dive into that, you're a Middlesbrough fan. When was your first Middlesbrough game? Why are they the team for you?
So my first ever Borough game was actually, funnily enough, in the 92-93 Premier League season. We didn't have season tickets and we didn't go to games before, but my dad's friend had gone on holiday, and basically there's a few games at the back end of the season. So we're talking like April, May 93, and he couldn't go to the game. So he said, my dad's called Rob. Rob, do you and your son want to go to the match? And we're like, yeah, that's brilliant. I'd love to go. So I went to Ayresome Park, and my first game was a 1-0 win against Arsenal, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Because I obviously knew about Arsenal. I'd kind of been brought up on Tottenham, weirdly, because my uncle was a Gaza fan. So I'd watched loads of videos, but I knew who Arsenal were. I knew they were a big team. I knew that was a big thing to win the game. But it was weird being in a football stadium, not hearing any commentary. That was like, my memory was kind of like, where is the person who's telling me who these players are? They've got no names on the back of the shirts. I'm just trying to read my program at the same time, but the program doesn't match the shirt numbers. And it's kind of, they're like my early memories. And I'm pretty sure it was a night game as well. So it's quite interesting that was like my first experience of being a Borough fan. But I'm from Middlesbrough. So it's one of those places where generally you will support Middlesbrough if you're from Middlesbrough, because there's not a lot of affinity towards other areas like Manchester, Liverpool. They've got people who've come in and out of the cities and stuff like that. But there's a study at one point where, we had one of the highest percentages of season ticket holders from the area. So it's kind of inbuilt that you're a Borough fan if you're born in the Borough. So yeah, it all started in 93.
And that is a bit of a sensory overload, especially when you're a child. Night match, football, that atmosphere and going through it. And for anyone who did get into football at that sort of age, and probably even this period, I imagine you were hooked, that atmosphere at Ayresome Park.
Yeah, it was amazing because it was nothing like you'd ever seen before. You'd been to the cinema and seen like a big blockbuster that you wanted to see. You might have been to see a pantomime at Christmas with your mum and dad, but being in a football stadium where there's kind of that partisan atmosphere of the home crowd, the noise, the smells. I did a few podcasts as part of what I do with the Borough Mag, and a lot of people talk about how green the Ayresome Park grass is. And it's that kind of vivid thing that brings football to life, I think. And seeing live football is so different to watching football on TV. The vantage point that you've got, what you see, how you feel the flow of the game, especially when you've got a big crowd in there or a big team. And we got relegated that season, and we were in a relegation fight for quite a big part of the season, but there was still that element of, we think we can win this. Even whatever's gone before, whatever the form's been like, because we're all together, because we all support Borough, we all want to try and sort of will the team to get the win. So from there, we didn't go back again. We didn't go back the following season. I think we went to like a testimonial. Brian Robson took over in 94. So that was, I had a bit of a dalliance with Man United, being a bit of a glory fan for about 18 months because they were winning stuff and they were on TV. But then it was like, oh, hang on a minute. Brian Robson's gone to where? Gone to Middlesbrough. That seems a bit odd. From there, it just, I mean, if anybody follows 90s football, you know that it just snowballed for Borough from there with Juninho and Ravanelli and cup finals and relegations. And it was a pretty amazing time to be a Borough fan, to be honest.
Let's transport you back to 1992 then. Your beloved Borough have been promoted back into the top flight after a 3-year hiatus, at just the right time to join the Premiership party. Did that make it an even bigger deal from a fan's point of view that the Premier League, the Premiership was dawning, or was it, again, as a child, just good to see Middlesbrough back in the top flight?
It's funny, actually. I've got two different answers to that. One is my answer, like, post age 20, and one of them is like when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I had no clue. Didn't realize anything about the past before that. Didn't know that the league was changing. I vaguely remember watching a bit of football on TV, like a bit of Match of the Day. For me, it just felt like you were just in another league. It didn't really matter too much. It felt quite important when my dad was taking me to watch Arsenal, saying, they were the league champions. They've got loads of good players. They're one of the big clubs. You kind of understand it from that point of view. Then as you get older, you start to understand a little bit more about the history of football and the club itself. And I never really knew lots about Borough's history for quite a while, because when I was in, that time, the 90s, it was Football Italia. I had a season ticket to watch the match. You played Championship Manager. You played FIFA on the Game Boy or whatever. So you kind of were in that little mini bubble. And one thing I always wondered about was why Borough had 1986 on the badge. So I was a bit like, all these clubs have got 18 whatever and 1905 and all this. Borough have got 1986. But I'd never really asked. I wasn't really that bothered about finding out about it. But as you get older, you realise that, well, actually, we nearly went out of business in 86 and we basically came back up the leagues. And I think our league season, the first division, which I think was 88, 89, probably didn't go that well after basically getting successive promotions, having possibly gone out of business. So I think for a lot of Borough fans at the time, getting back in the Premier League felt like we were sort of going to be on this crest of a wave that could take us forward. Getting relegated was obviously massively disappointing. But I think it changed Steve Gibson's mindset. I think he realised that Borough had to be in the Premier League. So looking back at it from an older point of view, you could see that getting Brian Robson, especially when he did, 94, before things start to boom, was massive, because he was such a draw to the club in the sense that we could get players we never would have even imagined getting. And he was the reason for it. Obviously, Gibson backed him massively with money. So I think for us, as fans, looking back on it now, it was huge that we were in that first Premier League season. But most of us probably think of Borough's Premier League starting in 95, because that's when we moved to the Riverside. We started to get Nick Barbie joined and etc. That is a bit of an anomaly, that 92, 93. Just kind of exists kind of in the ether a little bit further away.
That does nicely bring us to your first match choice. So I'm asking you to choose a Premier League game involving Middlesbrough. What have you gone for?
So this was quite a tough one to choose, actually. I nearly went for... So my first game as a season ticket holder was Ravanelli's debut.
Wow.
Right. Hat-trick, 3-3 against Liverpool. Really classic match. There's a Match of the Day version of it on YouTube. It's just brilliant. But I went for a year earlier because I think this was like when football was sold to me. rather than like the birth of modern football, it's like the birth of my sort of footballing fandom. So 20th of August, which is my birthday, we were on holiday in Mallorca. I was 10 years old. I'd got the Borough away kit, which is half black, half blue, which is the greatest Borough kit of all time. And we were away at Arsenal. So you've got that little link with me seeing them Borough against Arsenal the first time. At Highbury, sunshine, beaming down, opening game of the season. And we'd signed Nick Barmby from Spurs. That was huge because it was over £5 million that we bought him for. Bear in mind, Shearer had gone for, 3.3 million or whatever it was 3 years earlier. This was like massive, massive money. And I just remember, and it was on live on Sky. So me and my dad were sitting in a pub in Mallorca somewhere, watching Borough on TV in the Premier League. And this is where Sky had made everything a little bit more shiny. Everything was a little bit more rounded. There wasn't, there was no sumo wrestlers at halftime. There was no dodgy cheerleaders or garish Richard Keys jackets. It was very much, we are the football. We are telling the story. And Barmby scored. Brilliant, really, really brilliant goal. He linked up really well with Fjortoft and we scored. We drew one each in the end, but Dennis Bergkamp made his debut for Arsenal in that game as well. They had Ian Wright playing. It just felt like a really important game. I think the sunshine just makes you remember football. It's like sunshine, night matches, or like extreme rain. They're like your three... For me, they're like the three modes of football. The rest kind of just blend into one. But yeah, it was such an incredible game. And remembering the kits, remembering where you were, I think made it such a massive time. I could have picked my first game as a season ticket holder because that was like watching Ravanelli pull his shirt over his head after he'd scored in the Champions League against Ajax and then playing for Borough was just mad.
Being on holiday for the first day of the season, there was a couple of years where, as a kid in the 90s, I was in Spain or somewhere where every match, your choice of every match on TV, even if it wasn't my team, there's just something special about that, either watching Soccer Saturday or watching it with, Spanish commentary. And then you also mentioned, Middlesbrough being back in the Premier League, absolutely fantastic. And that Ravanelli game that you mentioned the following season, the opening game of the following season, I think it is, isn't it? Which was, even as a neutral, I remember that game and that hat-trick because it was such an exciting time. Opening day for Borough clearly holds fond memories.
Yeah, definitely. So we had that one, the Barmby 1-1. Then we played Liverpool. Liverpool were in that Ecru away shirt that was really baggy and oversized, the whole Spice Boy era. My era is obviously the 90s, obviously as a fan. But that just kind of really epitomised what football was like at that time, that you had teams like Borough who were spending a lot of money outside of the top 4, top 5, top 6 maybe that you have now. And it did feel like a bit more of a level playing field than it had now. And although, there's a lot of good that's happened over time, I think that parity is one of those things that when we look back, we think it was a bit more sort of equal in that sense. It probably wasn't really, let's be honest. There was still a big 5 or a big 6, but every year you had 2 or 3 teams who, spent £4 or £5 million and got themselves in. I think Nottingham Forest got up there, Newcastle got up there. It didn't go as well for Borough. I think when we signed Juninho, I think we were 4th in the league in about the October, November time in 95, 96. And then it just sort of declined from injuries, loss of form, that kind of thing, trying to fit Juninho into the side. But it was a brilliant time. It was an absolutely amazing time. Then the following year, 97, 98, we signed Paul Merson. So in the 97, 98 season, we beat Stoke 2-1 at home. Ravanelli scored last minute. Remember, we had like Mikael Beck, Ravanelli, Emerson stayed, Paul Merson. It was just crazy.
Coming on to your book, we're going to work our way through the chapters as you tell the story in your book. The Premier League is obviously a huge gear shift for English football, with Sky Sports investing a huge sum to reinvent coverage of football as we knew it. Meanwhile, the England team were toiling under Graham Taylor at the Euros. How do you reflect on that contrast between the domestic game getting a very expensive facelift, just as the national side, fresh off the back of Italia 90, are about to go through one of their bleakest spells?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Football's a very reactive game. In the game, you can set yourself up a certain way, but you've got to react to how the other team are set up. You react differently to being 1 goal down, to being 3 goals down. It's a very reactive. And I think from a structural point of view, it's also very reactive. So around that time, you've got the European clubs wanted a Super League. Surprise, surprise, just like they do now. The English game was in turmoil financially. We weren't able to compete in Europe because of various reasons. Hooliganism was rife. So the 80s was quite a dark time for football. Coming out of that, Italia 90 basically was a boom in terms of people following England. But really what it actually did was it reignited support in the domestic game more than anything else. The appointment of Graham Taylor then after Bobby Robson was probably not what people thought was going to happen, but it was really predictable because the FA, who had Charles Hughes as like a coaching expert, he'd invented POMO, P-O-M-O, position of maximal opportunity. Hoof it long, chase the ball, and have as many shots on goal as you can. That was kind of his philosophy, and that was flowing through the FA, that was thrown through all their coaching courses, and Graham Taylor was a little bit more of a sophisticated version of that. He'd made some really good young attacking sides at Watford, then Aston Villa, he'd got high up in the table, so he wasn't just a long ball merchant, but he definitely had that reputation. So the FA brought out a blueprint that was supposed to try and change that and bring us more in line with the European game in terms of playing more with more flair, more passing, more technical ability, which again sounds familiar from probably 10 or 15 years ago. So all these sort of reforms are coming into place, and they ended up saying that if we make a better top division, we'll have a better domestic game, which means we'll have a better international game. Foolishly, really, because the best players weren't in England, and clubs want short-term success. So if you give the clubs more money, eventually they're going to have to buy better players. They're not going to spend the money on English players just because they're English if they're not good enough, when they can pay the same amount or slightly less to a player from another country. So this is where you get the Premier League coming out with a blueprint. There was a whole host of stories around who wanted what. Some wanted it for greed. Some wanted it because they could make more money from TV, bolster the coffers of their clubs. The FA kind of said, oh yeah, why don't you just run it yourself, Premier League? That'll be a good idea. And then it sort of disconnects everybody from the football pyramid, which is still very unique in the sense that we've got so many professional clubs. The fact that the Premier League arrives, then eventually, Alan Sugar, I think, said after he basically got the deal done with Sky, he said, what's going to happen is all this extra money, we're just going to funnel it to players in terms of wages and other clubs in terms of transfers, which is basically what happened. And they had to buy more technical players, which were abroad. That made a better product, which meant you could sell it abroad. Then you could be successful when you're back in Europe. And it's that cycle. Then the foreign investment comes in, and it just sort of created that perfect storm, probably, of what we have now, in the sense that there's probably not many English business people who are rich enough to even afford Premier League clubs now. The academy system is the one thing that they sort of missed out in the blueprint. They didn't sort of say you need to have an academy with 20 players from Manchester if you're Man City or Man United or whatever. So all that sort of came about thinking it was going to create this enormous change in the national team. The national team stagnates really under Graham Taylor. Two things with Taylor. He was unlucky with injuries and he made really bad selections. Now, what you couldn't have one without the other. Obviously, he ended up making bad selections because players got injured, but he also ostracised quite a lot of players as well and didn't want to pick flair players. You know, he barely had Gaza coming off Italia 90, and that's tricky. Chris Waddle ends up retiring. John Barnes doesn't get used much. Peter Beardsley doesn't get used much. Lineker retires. Euro 92's rubbish from an English point of view, basically. The new Premier League and then the Graham Taylor era kind of don't really sit that well. They're almost like two separate things, but they weren't. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was supposed to be that the domestic game made the international team better.
Interesting what you say about flair players. I mean, of course, one of the players that was absolutely ripping it up in the early years of the Premier League that never got a look in was Matt Letizia. I mean, that's another player that Graham Taylor never fancied, did he?
Alan Ball was the best manager they ever played under, because Alan Ball said to the other 10 Southampton players, get the ball to Matt Letizia and he will do whatever we need him to. Now, I might get this wrong, but I'm sure he scored 25 goals and got 18 assists or 17 assists in the full season. I think he only had a season and a half or 2 seasons with Alan Ball. And his goals and assist ratio, now, they'd be like, no, on Twitter when it's like contributions or whatever, Letizia will be the top every time. So Lineker finishes in 92. Alan Smith doesn't really get a look in much after that. But then you go through, you got Shearer and Sheringham. But behind that, you got Fowler and Ferdinand. Then you've got Matt Letizia. Dion Dublin's knocking around at the time. Chris Sutton's around at that time. Ian Wright's around at that time. Andy Cole's, there's 9 forwards alone that you think, if they were playing now, you'd say, actually, they're better than Callum Wilson. They're better than Tammy Abraham. I'd have them in the squad. But back then, almost having that embarrassment of riches really was quite interesting for when Venables arrives in like 94 to take it from there.
Okay, the second match for your deserted island is a non-Premier League Middlesbrough game. So any game involving Middlesbrough that isn't in the Premier League, what have you gone for?
It was quite tricky to choose this one because there was a couple of options that I could have had. I think Gibson realised that if we were a bit of a cup team, he could create more revenue by getting further in the cups. we could possibly win a trophy because United at that time were just dominating. Blackburn were outspending other teams. So he wanted to really do well in the Cups. And he always told Brian Robson, you must do well in the Cups. So in the 96-97 season, we had I think we had a 5-1 against Huddersfield, a 7-0 against Hereford. And you look back and think, wow, God, Borough's reserves must have done really well to beat them. It's like, nope, Ravanelli was playing, Janino was playing, Emerson was playing. He literally played all the best players to get us as far as possible in the Cup. It probably did cost us in the league in the end, as well as the docked 3 points. I could have gone for some of those games, but I'm actually going for 2 games. I'm cheating, basically. I'm going for 2 games because we're in Europe for 2 seasons, so I think I can take this. So the 2 comebacks in the UEFA Cup run. So we played Basel and we played Steaua Bucharest, and I was at university at the time in Sheffield, so I'd got the train back that afternoon or that day or whatever to go and watch the games. We weren't getting full houses. People think, oh, it'd be amazing to get European football again. Well, when we had it, we had about 20,000, 22,000. People, just saw it as extra games. But anyway, we played Basel, and we got beat 2-0 in the first leg, and they went 1-0 up quickly in the second. 3-0 down aggregate. In the Bucharest game, we lost 1-0 in Bucharest. We went 2-0 down within 10 or 15 minutes. So we needed 4 goals in each of the games to go through. And the Basel game, he ends up playing not 4-2-4. He basically plays 2-4-4. So we had 2. This is Steve McLaren. 2 defenders, and then just as many forwards as we can get. So at the time, we had Yakubu, Hasselbank, Viduka, and Massimo Macaroni, who we'd signed as a big marquee player. Kind of went on loan for a bit, came back, and was kind of a bit of a cult hero / fan favourite. So we get to the point where we need 1 goal, and against Basel, he scores in the last minute. And the whole place just goes absolutely crazy. And you can imagine what that's like. Quarter-final of a UEFA Cup. We've never really been anywhere like this before, and he scores it. Then there's the Bucharest game, the second one. We're in exactly the same position. Macaroni's got us back into it. All these goals merged, by the way. So we Borough fans go, no, he didn't score that one. But anyway, there's loads of goals. Stuart Downing was just incredible. I think he was about 19 or 20 at the time, and he just ripped their right back to shreds. But anyway, gets the ball, left wing, breaks out from a corner, gets it on the left wing. He just curls this ball. No, that horrible phrase I hate, the corridor of uncertainty, which is just a bit trite, isn't it? So it goes right across the 6-yard box, and Macaroni basically goes horizontal in the air, and then just rifle headers it into the back, and the whole place just goes absolutely crazy. And for those 3 goals, the 8.2 million or whatever we bought him for was instantly repaid.
I was looking at these games, and Macaroni comes on as a sub in both games, doesn't he? So he's obviously an impact sub in the first one. He actually comes on for Gareth Southgate in the 26th minute, doesn't he? I remember watching that game, but I don't remember this. Was that an injury? Was that a tactical substitution? Was he throwing the kitchen sink for 26 minutes, or was it an injury?
No, it was an injury. We'd had a lot of games. I think we were in the FA Cup semi-final that season as well, so the games were just racking up against us. We not done well in the league, so yeah, he got taken off injured, and it was kind of like, oh, let's bring another defender on, let's bring in a midfielder. He just went, you know what, just get him on. We need 4 goals, so it's pretty mad, really.
For Middlesbrough to do that, the ones was an incredible performance. For history to repeat itself so soon after, and Macaroni to be the hero again. You say a cult hero, as I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong. As I recall, they were obviously his defining moments for Middlesbrough. But had he struggled a little bit to live up to the price tag aside from those moments?
So when he first signed, I think he played against England at Elland Road. I think he might have won a penalty or should have won a penalty or something like that, because he'd been a star in the under-21s at that point. We signed him for 8 million. I think he scored 2 on his home debut against Fulham. The first part of the season, I think he'd scored 5 or 6 goals within his first 10 or 12 games. We thought, this is amazing. We've got this young striker who, if he's not here for 5 years, we're going to double our money on him because he just looks brilliant. He lost his way, didn't quite do as well as we wanted him to, and then gradually ended up going out on loan because McLaren sort of realised he ended up filling the squad with really experienced Premier League players. So he'd already brought Southgate in. Ehiyog was already there. We went and got George Boateng. He ended up bringing Hasselbank and Viduka in. Then he brought Ray Parlour in, Zenden, Reisiger. It was like, let's just make this team. Everyone's aged 26 to 32. So everyone in the dressing room is on each other. There's a real responsible atmosphere. And I think he just kind of got a bit lost. So he had a couple of loan spells, but came back. I feel like he left on a free that summer. Maybe he left on a free that year or the year after, but we made no money on him, basically. But we got to UEFA Cup final, which is all anyone cares about, really.
Yep, another cult Italian striker to go to the Riverside history books. Coming back to the book and the next chapter, money flows through the game like never before, with the world transfer record broken 3 times in one summer. Who were some of the more notable players on the move that year?
This is an amazing summer for transfers. I actually, on my phone, I've saved a picture, a screen grab from World Soccer, because some of the transfers that are on here are just absolutely crazy. The top 3 transfers in the world at that time were all in the summer of 1992. And it was Milan and Juventus trying to outspend each other. So you had Papan move to Milan, you had Vialli move to Juventus, Lentini moved to Milan. So we're talking now, Papan went for 10 million. Vialli went for 12.5 and Lentini went for 13 million. Wow. Now, what I find is crazy about that is some Premier League players are buying first team players for that amount now. 10 to 15 million, 20 million. And we're talking 1992 at this point. Some of all the big transfers that year. So David Platt went to Juventus from Bari. So he'd become a bit of a star in a team that got relegated, Bari, who had Zvonimir Boban there as well on loan from Milan. So that's another bit of a star. Gaza obviously went to Lazio that summer. Should have gone the year before for about 3 million more, but decided he wanted to break his leg in 2. George Weah's another one that kind of goes a little bit under the radar before he went to PSG and Milan. He was actually at Monaco, and he was there with Arsene Wenger and Emmanuel Petit. I think Lilian Thuram was there, so he went to PSG that summer. So there was some really, really big names, but when you look back, it's just some of those other names that you see there. So you had Scalacci, who was obviously famous in Italia 90. Matteo Sammer goes to Inter Milan, who basically started to buy an absolute ton of players. And then in England, it was a little bit strange again, because obviously more money came into the Premier League from the new TV deal. Alan Shearer at 3.6 million wasn't really that big of a deal in terms of like world transfers. 92 Shearer goes as the British record or English record at 3.6 million. 4 years later, he goes for a world record 15 million. So I suppose that just shows you the difference in the Premier League just over that period, doesn't it?
Yeah, just in those 3 years, and that's when the Premier League, you can see, is beginning. I mean, there's still a lot of money in Italy, and then I guess Spain comes in a little bit after that. And as we get to the end of the night, it's Spain beginning to break those records, isn't it?
Yeah, it isn't. I think Italian teams, they were owned by huge organisations like the Agnelli family with Fiat. You had Berlusconi, who owned all kinds of TV products. Sergio Cragnotti comes in a little bit later on with Lazio. They were the ones who were funneling money. Berlusconi wanted to have 2 squads. He wanted a squad to win the league, and he wanted a squad to win in Europe. So they didn't care how many. So you'd have 3 non-national players or 3 foreign players, if you like. Anyone who plays Champ Manager around this time, you'll remember that little blue square that said FGN. And you're like, oh, I can't believe I bought it another FGN. But Milan had about 7 at the time, but you only play 3. So it's quite interesting that he didn't care. He was like, yeah, just leave him on the bench or leave him in the stands. They just had a really, really amazing squad, a real top side, that Milan team.
And of course, quite pioneering in that respect, because now that is the way the game's gone. I mean, we are talking about an era where teams are winning the league with maybe still 14, 15, 16 players used, whereas actually to build an entire squad of 22, 24, 25 players was, I guess, completely unheard of.
Yeah, definitely. I've had a little bit of stick online for the title of the book. Everybody just wants to say, the death of modern football or the year that Sky killed football and all this sort of stuff. But most of the stuff that was happening then has found its way into all different countries now. People were already doing it. Yeah, it's become more commercialised. Yes, there's a lot more money in the game. But we don't actually know what English football would look like if this hadn't have happened. There is an alternative reality where we have 48 professional clubs and 2 leagues of 24, or we could be like Germany where there's 9 divisions or 10, but a lot of them are regional, maybe semi-professional. Same in France. There are a lot of negatives to it, but there's probably more good come out of it than bad.
The third game you're going to get on VHS to take with you to Deserted Island is any Premier League game that doesn't feature Borough. So which Premier League classic have you gone for?
Now, any Borough fans can just turn off for the next 5 minutes with this next little selection, so it doesn't go against me. There's quite a few that I could have picked. There's all the classic, 4-3, the Liverpool-Newcastle ones, but I did pick another Newcastle game. I suppose I wanted to pick a game that sort of summarised the intrigue in that Premiership era, especially around the mid-90s when there was Blackburn and United to start with fighting it out. Then it was Newcastle and United. So I picked the 5-0 Newcastle win at St James's Park over United because it just felt like a real peak of that era, because United had won titles. They were a brilliant team. Fergie had got, you could argue it's fully by design that they had the class of 92 ready. They did try and put a lot more into the academy. A lot of it was probably a little bit of luck that they got such quality around at the same time. But Keegan had built a team where he'd got rid of Andy Cole, which caused them such massive problems. But they'd invested in Les Ferdinand. The following year, they'd invested in Alan Shearer. They already had Philippe Albert. They'd got Ginola. They had Faustino Asprilla. They had Beardsley, Batty. They had a proper 90s football team. And nobody was going to beat United. That was kind of the thing. They'd already chased down Newcastle the year before. But this season, that 5-0, you just think, this is the absolute peak of football. It's not going to get that much better for Newcastle unless they win the league. And I think because they didn't win the league, this game is always going to be held up as one of those sort of, possibly like a turning point game, where you think if they carried on going, that would be like a legendary moment in Premier League history of, this is the time when they shifted and they were able to beat United. But then it unravels, Keegan leaves, United chase them down, and it just gets to a point where they're competitive at the top end of the league, but this felt like a real sort of apex point. And in the Premier League sort of infancy, you got Newcastle in those big baggy Adidas shirts that are hanging off them. And then you've got United there as well, with players like Cantona and all the young players. And then you've got Albert chipping the keeper. You just think that's like the little cherry on the top of that Premier League era.
And the atmosphere in St James's on the TV, and when you watch that game back, is unbelievable. Obviously, there is so much pent-up frustration because they'd blown that lead the season before. There'd been so much animosity between Keegan and the famous would love it if we beat them and Fergie's mind games. And it feels like that is all just unleashed on Man United in one afternoon. I actually remember that game. I didn't watch it. We'd been out for the day, and I remember putting it on teletext and not believing my eyes. As you say, it was just an unbelievable game. But it really, really benefits from a rewatch, doesn't it?
Oh, massively, yeah. Just a lot of people sort of scoff at football from this era, don't they? And say, they're all just hoofing it up the pitch and there's no passing. They're all just, you just watch it and you think they were two really, really good teams. Yeah, we didn't do as well in Europe in that 90s period as we possibly could have. But that was just because a lot of the time the game was just trying to catch up with developments that had gone on abroad. That's totally understandable. But when you've got a team like Newcastle or any team at their peak, when they do something like that, I think Chelsea did it to United, didn't they? Late 90s or early 2000s, maybe they beat them 5-0 or 5-1 or something like that. And you do get ththose games. And United had those games at times where a team would just absolutely take them to the cleaners. But that felt like a real moment. Like if you ever watch back Premier League years or anything like that, it feels like a real big sort of high point for the league.
Back to 1992, another seismic change is the introduction of the Champions League format, which replaces the European Cup. This has long been controversial as it introduced teams who hadn't won their domestic leagues and also brought in a group stage format similar to international tournaments. How did that idea come about?
I think I made the point before about being reactive, and this is probably one of the ultimate reactive changes. It was basically, how can we get the big clubs more money? How can we get more eyes glued to the TV? How can we stop these big clubs running away and making a Super League? Now, I think fans would probably stop any form of Super League unless it was going to run alongside a domestic league. I don't think fans of Barcelona, Real Madrid, Juventus would ever give up like domestic competition. It's the lifeblood. Even if you've got fans from around the world now, they realise that it's the Premier League, it's Serie A, it's the Bundesliga that actually makes their team important or relevant. What was happening was, it was obviously not a seeded draw a lot of the time. So you could have Liverpool v Real Madrid in the first round. You could have AC Milan versus Marseille. And if one of them went out, that was it. The extra revenue you might get as a big club from prize money or higher attendances was gone. So a lot of people probably don't realise that the actual Champions League format came in 92, 93, but it came in at the end. So it was coming in before the final. So it meant that you had a little league section with the best knockout teams, if you like. They'd gone through their rounds. So you had teams like Rangers and Marseille or whatnot. And they were in there and they were within that. So that Champions League branding that started in that year started to change the focus of the tournament. It wasn't a full Champions League. It wasn't called the Champions League at that point. They just had a Champions League stage. And that carried on for a little bit longer. But it guaranteed money to those clubs. So if you knew you were in the group stage, you knew you'd have home and away games that would guarantee you a certain amount of prize money, guarantee you a certain amount of TV money, and a certain amount of revenue. That might get you 15% more income than your rivals, which meant you could pay more wages, which meant you could buy better players on higher transfer fees. And that cycle is what starts what we have now in terms of that almost closed shop, because teams who get in the Champions League invariably qualify year after year after year, even if they're second or third. And again, it plays into Sky's hands a little bit because it creates a new story. There can only be one league winner, but there can be two teams that go in the Champions League. So it's the race for second once the league's won. And then it becomes the race for third. Then it's the race for fourth. And then it's the Europa League's important because you can qualify for the Champions League. So again, those stories start to weave in and out, which obviously draws people to TV, which was a big, big factor in bringing about the Champions League in 1992.
Sticking with European football, the fourth game is a European club tie that you take with you. What would you go for?
So I tried to be a little bit clever here and pick the Borough European game for the other one, so I could have this game in particular. So this is one of the first sort of football matches I really remember watching on TV. I watched USA 94 just after this. That kind of increased the appetite for watching football on TV. So it's the 1994 European Cup / Champions League final with AC Milan and Barcelona. So I obviously knew AC Milan well from watching Gazzetta. I'd managed them for many years on Championship Manager, so I knew the squad inside out. I knew how to beat Barcelona, obviously, as a 9-year-old. But I think it was this is a holiday theme going on. I think it was just before we went on our first holiday abroad, because it used to be midweek. Didn't it? The Champions League was like a Wednesday night for the match. So it was on ITV and we were packing for holiday, I think, because we were sneaking out of school before the Easter holidays or whenever it was. Watching AC Milan absolutely annihilate Barcelona was like, what is this? This is not the football that I'm watching at home. This is not what's on Match of the Day. This is not what I saw when I went to Ayresome Park. This is not what I'm seeing on the big match with Roger Thames on ITV on a Sunday afternoon. This is different. Because that team, with all their suspensions, when people think about that Milan team, they immediately think about the defence. But they had Baresi and Costa Curta suspended, so they didn't even play the final. Van Basten didn't play, injured. He didn't pick Papan, Laudrup, Radachoyu, because they had too many foreigners, like I said before. To watch them demolish the dream team, which was Cruyff's Barcelona, in the way that they did, and some of the goals they scored, you had like Desai, just powering past players. Savicevic was unbelievable in that game. Just really sort of stayed in my mind as a match that I thought, this is like pure, unadulterated, amazing, amazing football.
And the Savicevic goal is absolutely incredible as well, isn't it? He gets the third. And then, as you say, Desai just sort of bounding forward and played it in. I mean, we got a glimpse of him in the Premier League towards the end of his career. But again, what a player Marcel Desai was.
Yeah, it's interesting because eventually these players start coming to the Premier League. You think, oh, I've only seen him with James Richardson on a Saturday. What's he doing playing for Sheffield Wednesday or Middlesbrough or all these other teams that were sort of unfashionable a little bit? I mean, Chelsea were unfashionable when Ruud Gullit went there. I know they had Glenn Hoddle as player manager, but they weren't what they are now when Gullit arrived. They weren't what they are now when Vialli arrived, or even Zola in that little period of time. So it was interesting to see those players start arriving. Then people like Desai arrive, and you think, right, this is where we get that shift of the Premier League can afford a little bit more money for wages. They're quite happy to pay it to someone who's a little bit older. And obviously the Italian clubs just thought, we're not giving Desai a 4-year contract from age 31 to 35. That's crazy. But we were still trying to grow the game, and seeing some of those players play in our league was just amazing.
Anyone who lived through that era of Football Italia, which was the only regular live football that was on a Sunday afternoon in that mid-90s. So it was a real treat, especially if you didn't have Sky Sports at that time, which most households, including mine, didn't.
Yeah, we had ITV Time Tees. So obviously that was when ITV was very regionalised. So in 94, 95, we used to get the Borough games when Brian Robson in the promotion season, but it wasn't every week. It was regular enough for you to remember. Like I remember Borough drawing 2-2 with Sunderland. I remember us beating other teams along the way. But Football Italia, so I used to, on a Saturday morning, to get up early. I used to often watch like the Gaelic games used to be on or something. Then Transworld Sport would be on 8 till 9. So you'd be trying to grab a little bit of football, maybe from other countries at that point, to help your Champman research. Then the morning line 9 till 10 was an absolute killer. So you'd whack live and kicking on. And then everyone would come downstairs, tell you to go upstairs, put your little portable TV on, and then there'd be James Richardson, and you'd be watching the highlights. That was the only way to consume it. And then it was shoot, match, 4-4-2, a bit of 90 minutes if you're feeling a bit grown up. That was kind of where you got all the information from. And I think 92 sort of, and after, made football clubs, TV companies realise that there was a massive appetite for that. And I think that's one of the reasons why Sky was so successful, that they said to the Premier League, this is how much time we will give to you. Not just an hour and a half on a Saturday night with a bit of highlights, but we'll have magazine shows, review shows, tactics. It was a real boom time, really.
And those Saturdays had football focus, grandstand, Baywatch, and Gladiators.
Yeah.
You've got my entire
Dream
Saturday
time.
right there. So, in international football, which is a chapter in the book you covered, Denmark win Euro 1992, having been a late replacement for Yugoslavia. It's a well-told story in football parlance, of course, but it only adds to the magic of such a seismic year. Can you summarise what happened with Denmark not qualifying, then becoming European champions, for anyone who hasn't heard that story? Could it ever happen again, do you think, in the modern era?
The Yugoslavia story is an interesting one, because I tweeted months ago now from the account the picture of what possibly would have been the squad in 92, but it was when they were in the 1987 under-21 squad. The names that are in that team are just frightening. You got Prosinecki and Yanni and Savicevic, Suker, players like that who would eventually go on to play for Croatia or Yugoslavia. So because the Balkan War and what was going on in terms of that region of Yugoslavia, basically the civil war, UEFA sort of said, well, you're banned from any competition if you don't stop what you're doing, basically. And obviously all the atrocities that continue to happen went right into the 90s, despite some of the fractions being able to move away. So Denmark were a very, very hurried replacement for Yugoslavia. They were a solid team. They were a decent team. They had some decent players. Michael Laudrup hated the coach. So did Brian Laudrup, didn't he? Because they wanted to play such stale, boring football. Obviously, Michael Laudrup been part of the 86 World Cup squad. Didn't like the way the team was going. So he basically said, I'm not coming back to play. Laudrup, Brian did come back. They had Peter Schmeichel in goal. They just sort of worked their way to the final, past the Germany and Holland team who were in the tournament, and a France team who were pretty good sides with a lot of good players. But they just found a way to win. They worked harder than anybody else, defended better than anyone else, and they used the back pass rule that hadn't yet changed pretty well to actually nullify the threat of a lot of these teams. And with some Schmeichel brilliance, which if you think he'd gone to United before that, I think if he was available afterwards, he would have gone for a lot more than I think the £800,000 that United had paid for him after that tournament, because he was a star. And could it happen again? We had Greece in Euro 2004, which is probably the closest thing that we've come since then. So that was, 10, 12 years after. Could it happen now? I mean, if England win, it would probably be as unlikely as one of those teams winning a tournament, but probably going to be some kind of team who are really set up with a real strict tactical structure. Maybe everyone's just willing to do that role. So probably Greece as close to that. But, you know, as time goes on, you think it's getting further and further away.
Well, sticking with international football then, the fifth match I've asked you to take with you is an international game you'd relive forever. What have you gone for?
So we're back to the mid-90s again. I feel like 94 to like 98 is like an absolute glorious period of, for me, it's the end of primary school and the start of secondary school, when football just becomes absolutely everything, and it's just the peak of your life, and it's just brilliant. And Euro 96 is just one of those tournaments. And it's funny how you remember back, and when you try and remember what was going on. I remember watching the Switzerland game when Shearer hadn't scored for 700 games or whatever, and he'd scored in that game. It was boring. It was a really, really boring draw. So the Scotland game was on. I didn't even know it was on. I went on the field and played football with my mates because they were like, the Euro, we didn't even know England were playing. You weren't into that frame of mind. Just went out with the ball on a Saturday afternoon and played. Then when I came back, I think I missed the first goal, but saw the Gaza goal. And then obviously you were like, right, what's the next game? So my game that I've picked is the England-Holland game, third group game. And it's like, that was like AC Milan 4, Barcelona 0. That was like football euphoria, but on a totally different level. So because we'd had footballs coming home, I'd just finished primary school, about to start secondary school. Borough had stayed in the Premier League. We'd signed Emerson already. I can't remember if we signed Ravenel before or after the Euros, but it's that period of time where you think the club's going places. We've been linked with some really exciting players. But that match, that 4-1, I remember the crowd, that sort of hazy summer evening. You know, you've got Britpop's massive. Everything culturally feels great. Labour are about to get into power, and you felt like things were sort of starting anew. And it is important that you have that cultural and political element when you look back. You've obviously got your child memories. My memories, like Shearer leaning back and smashing it into the top corner. But you remember, why was everybody feeling like that at the time? So when you're a bit older, you think that wasn't just any win in a tournament. That was a really important moment for English football because we were changing the way that we were seen. And I think that's a really huge thing. And then obviously Clivert scores right at the end and knocks Scotland out of the tournament as well. So you had that like weird little element that was playing it towards the end. But just watching an England performance like that, and again, that's another one. I think ITV might have put them on again. Did they put all the Euros matches on again? I feel like they put them on full length on YouTube. And that was one where you look at us and you've got really, really good players who are technically good, playing for England.
They actually put them on during the pandemic, didn't they? When Euro 2020 should have been happening, they actually put them on. And I confess to sitting and having them all on throughout that again, because that was a magical night. And I was 11 years old that night. And I remember that my mum and dad had a blazing argument. I think possibly because football had been on the television wall to wall for like the best part of a week and a half. And I can still remember my mum was in the bedroom, I don't think they were talking, and I just remember my dad running through the kitchen to her going, "We're beating Holland 4-0. Like it was it actually broke the ice from whatever argument they were having. So yeah, that was just an incredible night. And Sheringham and Shearer, the way that they linked up that night, and I think Teddy Sheringham, of course, it was Alan Shearer's tournament, but Teddy Sheringham's selflessness as a striking partner for Alan Shearer, that layoff that you talk about, where he fakes to shoot, is just again, I can see it just talking about it.
It's absolute magic. You've got the orange of the Dutch kit. You've got that white England kit that has the sort of light and dark blue on it with the numbers and the names as well, which they kind of use a little bit in this tournament. You've got Gaza, absolutely on form. Tony Adams, who'd had all his issues and had come out the other side as this sort of real leader in the team. And then you got David Seaman, who just looked like the best keeper in the world. And it was the first time I ever cried at football is when we got beat by Germany on penalties. Because I thought we've beat Holland 4-1, we beat Spain. No one's going to beat us. I don't care about the Germans. Who have they got? It felt like they weren't as starry as they had been before. And obviously, when you look back, they actually were a pretty good team. But yeah, I remember that Southgate penalty missing and crying, thinking, "Wow, that's just the worst feeling that I've ever felt." And it's about football, and you just kind of realise that at that point in time, you just hooked. Because I think I remember watching the final, but not really being bothered.
It was a complete damp squib, wasn't it? Which I think actually Baddiel and Skinner even reference in the lyrics to the re-release in '98 of actually, they'd been the balloon had been burst in midweek, and it was just a slow trudge towards. I even think it might be a memory. I even seem to remember it being a wet and rainy kind of final, like a grey day, like basically the summer had finished that night, and now it was all over. Coming back to 1992, the move of football to Sky led to a bit of creativity from the execs at Channel 4. We've touched upon this. Football Italia coincided with Gazza's spell at Lazio and became hugely popular. In an era when football is saturated, it's probably hard for younger listeners to understand why so many of us were invested in teams at the other side of Europe. Why was that programme so special?
Again, I think like a lot of these events, it's a real perfect storm. It was free. That is the huge, huge thing. Football was no longer free. After 1992, football cost you money. And I know that tickets have always cost and shirts, but it cost you in the home. And I don't think that was such a big sea change for people. Anything that was going to be available for free, and for Channel 4, they paid a lot less than Sky did. That was always going to be a winner. But it never talked down to you as a fan. I was like 9, 10, 11, 12, sort of in that mid-90s period when I started watching it. I never felt like I was an idiot. It wasn't like, this is how you say this in Italian. This is this player. It wasn't. It was like, this is the football. We're going to talk about it like you know everything about it, even though you don't. And that's how we're going to get you in. From a cultural point of view, it was so different. The football was really different. It wasn't as defensive as people think it was, because there's a lot of Premier League games that you watch now that are really boring because they're not as adventurous as you think. But they had the best players. They had the best players in the world. A lot of the weeklies like Shoot and Match started to do like Football Italia sections. And to be fair, on Gazzetta, they did try and do sort of little sketches and skits that you can see on YouTube. But after a while, I think they realised that maybe that's not what people were watching for. They wanted more football content, or as much football content as we could take. But even the kits and the fans look different, and the stadiums, obviously they'd had Italia 90, so a lot of the stadiums have been newly built for that tournament, and they looked it didn't look like Ayresome Park. It didn't even look like the Riverside. You know what I mean? Riverside was like this space age modern stadium. And then you've got like the San Siro or whatever. It was just, even the running tracks around the outside was so different to what we were used to.
I went to Italy a couple of summers ago, and we were in a coffee shop, and there was the pink paper there that James Richardson used to sit with, the Gazzetta, and I nearly lost my mind. It was just fantastic. James Richardson, very much the thinking man's Richard Keys. So the sixth match we'd like to take with you is any game from before the Premier League era that you'd go back and watch over and over. So what have you gone for?
A match that I've only ever seen highlights of. I've read the book 89, which is about this as well. And it's Liverpool 0, Arsenal 2. Because I just think there's so much drama and such an amazing story linked to that game. I'm reading the book 89 as well, and hearing what the players thought of it. It's just amazing that it went to the title went to the last game of the season, and the two teams that were going for the title were playing each other. Liverpool were the most dominant team English football's ever seen over that period of time, at home and in Europe. Arsenal were a really, really good side. George Graham made a really good team in there, and they were looking to obviously get back to winning titles. And the fact, the way it happens, the way the goals happen, just that thrill of the actual game. And Liverpool fans thinking it's a home game, Anfield, we're so strong there. We're going to beat Arsenal or get a draw. We'll win the league, another league title. That's going to be amazing. But being a Liverpool fan, I live in Liverpool now, and I can imagine what that must have been like at 1-0. And then thinking, oh my God, they've scored again. Like, what do you do? What do you do as a fan? I think that drama, that narrative, that story is what you eventually start loving about football. I just think the story around that, you can just watch it again and again.
And of course, famously, that game was on terrestrial TV, and this match is pointed to sometimes as this is maybe what we lost with the Sky years, that actually football moving behind effectively a paywall meant that the average fan didn't get to see that. And that's obviously a very, very fair point. I think the flip side is Jim Rosenthal, who was involved in that broadcast, admits that within 10 minutes of that game finishing, they had to cross over to the news at 10. So it's that kind of contrast that you talked about before, isn't it, of Sky offering that blanket coverage. We are going to come on air like FA Cup final days, the only comparison with terrestrial TV. We're going to come on air an hour before and we're going to stay on air an hour after. What do you make to that kind of balance of that being a moment that so many experienced on ITV, Brian Moore's famous commentary, with the fact that perhaps now that maybe doesn't happen? Let's say the Aguero moment for Manchester City probably was only experienced by a fraction of the fans that saw Michael Thomas's goal in '89.
I suppose that's the thing that the Premier League has taken away from a regular fan or a fan that might be coming into football for the first time, that not all football will be available to you to watch. Like, we grew up with Match of the Day, you had Football Italia, and you had the Champions League every week on ITV. So you could still see some Premier League players, but you could see a load of players from around Europe, which connected you with that world game. What's changed, or what could have been changed? Can't see it changing now, but just giving maybe the terrestrial TV channels maybe 10 games a season. Because often, I think in the 70s and 80s, that's all they were showing live. They were only showing 10 to 15, maybe 20 games a season. If they could have reached a deal to show that amount of games, maybe we'd be in a different place. And really, it wasn't going to harm the product, because you probably would have got more people subscribing to Sky Sports on the back of watching that. But also, it wouldn't be a clincher for someone who's undecided about what they want for their subscription. So that is a tricky one. I think losing the Champions League from terrestrial TV, I think that was pretty tough as well, because at least you had that one thing that you could watch with Brian Moore, with Clive Tilsley, learn about all these players. I think that's lost a little bit of its allure, I suppose, now, especially because a lot of the teams are the same. There's never going to be a right answer, because the terrestrial TV channels, as you say, didn't put football as the main product. It was a byproduct of what was popular at the time, really.
So back to 1992, it wasn't just the format of the leagues and cups that was changing. The very essence of the rules changed too. The pass-back law, which meant goalkeepers could no longer pick up the ball when passed from the feet of their own players, was a major change and caused a few issues initially. I mean, I've watched football from that era with my son, who's 14, and it looks like a different sport when the ball goes back and the goalie picks it up from a pass back. So how did that change affect football initially?
With hilarious results, as you can imagine, with consternation from journalists and people who thought the rule makers were trying to get in the way of the beautiful game as usual. But there's a whole swathe and generation of football fans who never watched a game live with a pass back. Even people who were sort of in the mid to late or even early mid-late 30s, 40s, they won't have ever seen games played that way. It just seems so alien because when we played football, as a kid, you couldn't pick the ball up off the defender. You had to hoof it. That was it. That was just part of football. But to start with, you obviously had keepers could only kick the ball out the hands, so they just got used to that. They couldn't play it off the floor. Defenders relied so much on a lack of pace because they knew they could just kick it back to the keeper. As long as they get it in the box somewhere, the keeper would generally get it and the attacks would break down. I think what is quite interesting from reading about it and researching about it, they almost thought there'd be no passes in the game at all because the ball would spend so long in the air from the goalkeeper hoofing it that it would be a terrible game or the ball would be out of play all the time. And you think, but the keeper was still hoofing it out of his hands every time he got the ball. So it's not really that different. The keepers just have to learn or improve on a skill that they may not have been using that much. So I think it was a brilliant one because after Italia 90, the tournament itself, in terms of a football point of view, got slated quite a bit from these FIFA analysts who look at the game and analyse whether it's entertaining or not or what needs to change. And that was, I think, a tactic that teams have become over-reliant on. So actually shifting away from that, I think, really helped because it makes the game more exciting. The flair players can attack the goalkeeper. And we get now where you've got Edison playing with the ball 2 centimetres away from his goal line with absolute ease. And he's not really that bothered. It's just become such a key part of the game now that looking back, it's a very, very odd watch, especially English football, who, are hoofing it from the halfway line back to the keeper.
Definitely one of the rules that improved the game. I think that's fairly unanimous. Okay, I'm now going to give you the opportunity to choose a current or former Premier League player to attempt a rescue mission from your island. But do be warned, if this rescue mission fails, you're going to have to see out your days with this player. Who have you gone for?
I went for a non-Borough player because I did, as I said, dally with Man United a little bit at the start of the 90s. And one of the players who I always remember, I had a 93-94 Champions video that was Man United. So it was a blue box, but the video itself was red. And I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And at the start of that, I think Man United are on a training camp in South Africa. And Brian Kidd and Ferguson are like shouting at the players, and the players are dripping with sweat. And it's like 500-degree heat. And then there's Roy Keane, like young, lean, angry, just being a footballer. And through that season, him playing with Ince and then going on to be just an absolute dominant star and captain for United, he's the person that I'd take because imagine having him bossing you around on a desert island telling you what to do. You're probably going to survive. You're probably going to end up fashioning some kind of vessel to get you off the island. And if not, you're going to have some great stories from Keane from in his early drinking days at United, playing with Cantona, moving into when he just sort of counsel some of the younger players through their careers. I just think he's brilliant. And I know that he got a lot of stick, especially when he first started being a pundit, but he's absolutely hilarious. Like you've got to laugh at someone who's either A, that angry about someone, or B, someone who calls out Jamie Redknapp for not having that many concrete opinions, really.
I've asked a few people this question. You're the first person to say Roy Keane. For what it's worth, I think he'd be mine as well. I was surprised it took this long someone to pick Roy Keane for exactly those reasons. So yeah, no, I think Roy Keane would get you off the island or be good value on it. Back to 1992. Your book ends on comparing 1992 with the present day. We've had the Super League proposal. There are changes afoot with UEFA and the Champions League as we record this in early 2023. We've seen the PGA Tour turned on its head with breakaway leagues and formats in golf. It's widely considered lots of football heavyweights are spending much more than they possibly can be generating. Is it a matter of time before another year the size of 1992 happens again?
I don't think it can happen to the extent where all of these things sort of interlink together and sort of create the perfect storm. But I do think we could have some big events happening in football in the next 5 to 10 years. As a supporter of a club who are now in the Championship, who are propped up with 10 to 15 million pound a year from our owner, who is getting older. We're going to be sold at some point or passed into the family who may not want to put £1 million a month into the club just to stay afloat. I think the comparisons between golf are quite an interesting one because as a sport, football is interwoven more into the culture of the place and the people. You sort of don't pass on your favourite golfer or your favourite Formula One driver or favourite Formula One team, but you would in sport. That's why obviously the Wimbledon, MK Dons, AFC Wimbledon thing probably never ever happen again because there'll be such an uproar about that. One thing that I hope could happen is some more concrete form of revenue sharing across the English leagues, because the Premier League has to realise that its members are in the Championship, its members are in League One, possibly even in League Two. But Bournemouth started out in League Two and they're back in the Premier League. Brighton have been there. Brighton have nearly been out of business. Borough have nearly been out of business. Where the fabric of what makes the Premier League what it is. If we were, Red Bull Middlesbrough, nobody would be that bothered, really, because we've come from nowhere, but we've got a history, we've got a culture, we've got all of that ties us to the town and to the leagues of previous years. And I think that's what the Premier League probably can't improve on in terms of breaking away. I follow NBA basketball quite a lot, and they basically have all the money goes in the pot. You're allowed to spend X amount of money on wages. Anything above that is the tax, which kind of is basically if you've got a rich owner, they'll pay the tax for better players. But it does create some parity, not 100% parity, but that element of having a more equal spread would be much better. Because let's be honest, these Premier League clubs who are getting £200 million a season, some hardened football manager players could run these clubs much better than the people who are there now. And I know it's obviously that's a big thing to say, and it's a ridiculously complex organisation to run. But some of the decisions that they make, you just think, why are you doing that? Why have you hired them? Why have you bought that player? Why have you done this? People or clubs in the Premier League think they're naturally better, just been richer for longer. And I think that's the big difference that I think will change. The Champions League, I think, will probably change. They're already using this league format, aren't they? I think from 2024. I don't think we'll see a Super League because there'll be enough teams that will kick up a stink that it won't actually happen, which is a good thing. I'd love English football to try and do something like the German clubs do with the 50+1, is it? Or a certain section of the club has to be owned by fan groups. I think that would be a positive step forward.
Yeah, potentially reform, but as you say, maybe never to the extent of 92 again. Okay, I'm going to give you the chance to delete a game from the history books by taking it to the deserted island with you. It can be a Middlesbrough game, it can be a match of your rival, something obscure. Which game would you banish to Room 101 forever, and would it have changed the course of history?
The game that I'm going to banish from history didn't exist in its original form. The game is in 96-97. It's Blackburn versus Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough had a massive injury crisis. We had about between 17 and 23 players, depending on which article you read. We had barely any youth players. We didn't have 100 to 150 player academies like we do now. So the club called the Premier League and they asked for the game to be called off. The Premier League didn't really say what was going to happen, but we put all the forms in. Blackburn found out late that the game was going to be called off, so they were absolutely incredulous with the Premier League and with us. We were struggling towards the bottom of the table at that point as well, which didn't help. So there's the kind of, are they just calling it off because they've got a load of injuries? They want their better players back. And for a club like Middlesbrough, who weren't a big club, but we had some big name players, this was a massive, massive thing. If we'd have played that game and got beat 10-0, we would have stayed in the Premier League. If we'd have got beat 50-0, we still would have stayed in the Premier League. The fact that we then lost our case on the day that Brian Robson got Manager of the Month for March, Juninho got Player of the Month for March, and it was announced that we were going to be docked 3 points and fined, is such a massive sliding doors moment for the club. Tom Flight wrote a good book, You're Joking, Aren't You?, which is looking at 96-97 as a season as a whole, which is a brilliant book, and talks a little bit about this. And some of the players that we were trying to sort of make links with, probably the highlight being Gabriel Batistuta was the plan, with a lot of money being spent. If we'd have stayed in the league, possibly won a cup, we would have been in Europe. They were looking to invest in players of that ilk. As the new Premier League deal would have kicked in, we would have had more money. Who knows where we could have been? My thing is we could have been Chelsea. Chelsea beat us in the FA Cup. They beat us in the League Cup the season after. They then went on to win the European Cup Winners' Cup. This is before Abramovich. Bought better players, attracted, I know it's London, but you get the kind of similarities. Maybe we wouldn't have been bought by an Abramovich, but still, we would have been possibly one of those clubs that we're looking at being in the top 10 on a regular basis for 10 years or 15 years. So that game, if we'd have just gone to that game, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah, and that Middlesbrough side, again, speaking as a neutral fan, I can understand why it's such a cult side for Middlesbrough fans, Ravanelli, Juninho, Emerson. And just to touch upon another game that I know that you had thought about taking with you, which was the Middlesbrough 3, Chesterfield 3 FA Cup semi-final in that run, which was, again, just one of the most incredible 120 minutes of football I think I've ever seen. I am from Chesterfield, so I know what it was like for people in Chesterfield. What on earth was it like being on the other side of that as a Middlesbrough fan?
Right, I've never, ever left a football match early, ever.
Right.
It's something that I would never, ever do. I just think you're there to watch the whole game. I don't care if I can get to the bar quicker or my car. I'm there to watch the full match. I said to my dad at half-time, can we leave? We were in Old Trafford. We were the very back of the second tier. So our view was kind of like funneled into the pitch. It was 2-0 at half-time, wasn't it, to Chesterfield? And I said to my dad, I said, we need to go. I said, I can't be here to watch this. Timelines are a bit hazy in this. I think we'd already lost the Coca-Cola Cup to Leicester in the replay, maybe at Hillsborough, I think, 1-0. And then it was the weekend after. Anyway, whichever order it was, it was a bit of a roller coaster time. And then you get back to 2-2. And then you're 3-2 up in extra time. And then Jamie Hewitt, a name that I've got no reason to ever remember, that nobody would ever remember. No disrespect to Jamie Hewitt. He's probably had a really good career as a professional at that level. Bounces up from nowhere to score that goal. You just think, what is going on? And obviously in that run, Mark Schwarzer couldn't play because he was cup tied in the FA Cup. Horrendous roller coaster. But at the time, I was 11, so I was at year 7 in secondary school. And we went to Wembley twice. We went to Hillsborough to see us get beat. We went to that semi-final, went to the semi-final replay, which was again at Hillsborough, which we won quite easily 3-0. Oh, what an unbelievable first season as a season ticket holder. And we also played United at Old Trafford away around that time in the torrential rain and drew 3-3 after being 3-1 up. And it's Gary Neville's first professional goal in that game as well. And that's another mad game. But yeah, the Chesterfield one was crazy.
Of course, Sean Dyche powers a penalty down the middle, doesn't he?
Yes,
there's the ball over the line that David Ellery doesn't give. I think that would have made it 3-1. I can actually tell you that Jamie Hewitt, he now works for the local hospice here in Chesterfield. He works for the retail teams, one of the van drivers. I actually used to work with him, and I never plucked up the courage to talk to him about that goal. But he's still a cult hero in Chesterfield for that moment against Middlesbrough. So yeah. Okay, before we finish the show and ask you the final question for your deserted island, we want your guidance to help us find the greatest player from every nation represented in the Premier League era to add them to our Premier League of Nations Hall of Fame. Today, it's a cracker. It's the turn of Angola. It's a long and illustrious list. Rob, who, in your opinion, is the greatest Angolan to play in the Premier League? There have been 3 of them. Is it Jordão, with 3 appearances for West Brom, helping them to 26 points and a 19th place finish in 2002-2003? Or is it Manucho, the man who made 1 substitute appearance for Manchester United before a loan spell at Hull City in 2008-2009, which saw him score 2 goals in 13 appearances? Don't let me sway you, but one of them was a last-minute winner against Fulham. Hull finished 17th, 1 point above relegated Newcastle, so that was quite an important goal. Or is it Helder Costa, with 1 goal in 25 appearances for Wolves and 3 goals in 24 appearances for Leeds United? 3 Angolans at the time of recording who play in the Premier League. Jordão, Manucho, Helder Costa. Who are you going for?
I mean, as you can imagine, I've done a lot of extensive research to make a decision just so we get the right player. Helder Costa is one of those 2 boring players who is neither a forward, he's not a winger, he kind of runs around and does stuff, so he's already out. Jordão, I'd never heard of, so I was like, right, Manucho, purely because he played for Manchester United. Somebody must have seen something at some point to say, we need to get him into one of the biggest football clubs in the world. So there must have been something that happened. So I'm going with Manucho because just on whoever sent that scout report in saw something that thought, we've got a player on our hands here.
Whoever saw that Arsene Wenger should end up at Arsenal possibly thought Manucho should end up at Man U, and it didn't quite work out as well. That's maybe the backstory. Okay, Manucho is Rob's choice. We're going to put this out on Twitter for you to have your vote. If you are part of the Helder Costa fan club screaming at the show right now, we will put this out on Twitter and reveal next week who the winner was. Finally, Rob, we're going to give you a football for your deserted island and task you with recreating an iconic Premier League goal to see out your days. Which Premier League goal would you recreate and why?
Well, I probably haven't mentioned his name enough. I get a lot of the lads who I work with are all Liverpool fans, glory supporters. They always take the mick for me mention Juninho all the time, even though he's an absolutely amazing player. So I picked a Juninho goal that I reckon wouldn't be that bad to recreate because there isn't too much dribbling within it. But it won goal of the month in March, which is an incredible month for Borough, where we went on an unbelievable run. And it looked like we were possibly going to stay up on points that we'd actually won, not actually been denied. So we were playing against Chelsea at home. And Gina gets the ball on the sideline with Emerson, plays a little 1-2, gives it to Mikael Beck, who did nothing better than put his head down so he wouldn't get shouted at by Ravanelli. Sprinted towards the touchline. Juninho, this is herring towards the box at this point. So this is going to have to be Roy Keane, isn't it? In a blonde wig. It's going to be Roy Keane in a blonde wig with a ponytail, crossing the ball for me. Crosses the ball, and he just gets in front of the defender. There's a little diving header. He's about a foot off the floor and just heads it into the net and then wheels away in delight. But it was such a massive win. Brilliant goal. Like I say, won player of the month that month. Pretty sure it won goal of the month as well. But just a class goal.
Brilliant. A great choice. And if you don't survive the desert island, you're going to have to survive asking Roy Keane to play the part of Mikael Beck. So that's going to be very interesting. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Your book, 1992, The Birth of Modern Football, is out now. Tell us a bit about where people can get it, where people can find you online. Tell us everything. Yeah,
so you can get the book now in bookshops, which is pretty crazy. You can order it online as well. Thank you to everyone who's pre-ordered it before now. I really appreciate that. You can find me at 92 Football Book. So basically, I just tweet about 92 players, kits, events, and I'm at Rob_Fletcher_ on Twitter, which is kind of my personal account, which is more of the same football chat and football shirts.
Brilliant. Well, the book is fantastic and the account is well worth a follow as well. Some really good retro memories. If you listen to this show, you're almost certainly someone who likes to relive retro football, and Rob's account is definitely one to follow. Rob Fletcher, thank you very much indeed.
So that was Rob. What a lovely guy. I realised halfway through that conversation, we would have probably been in the same year at school, I think. So very similar footballing educations. I loved that Middlesbrough team of 1996-97. They were fantastic to watch. And Rob clearly had a wonderful football upbringing, watching the excitement of Brian Robson's Middlesbrough team. His brilliant book is out now. It's so well researched. It's just a fascinating insight into all things 1992. I've put a link in the description. Go and buy that book. Go and buy that book as a gift for yourself, for someone else. You won't be disappointed. It's a really, really great book. So that's 1992, The Birth of Modern Football. Check the description for a link if you can't find it wherever you would normally buy your books. You heard Rob's pick for the greatest Angolan Premier League player. That is now going to be on our Twitter page for a short time after the show's release, so you can go on there and vote for it. The results are in from last week's show. The greatest Austrian Premier League player with a huge 86% of the votes is Paul Scharner, a Wigan hero, and you came out in force to vote for him, Wigan fans. So it was a landslide, ahead of Arnautovic, ahead of Fuchs, ahead of Meninga in that order. Paul Scharner, the greatest Austrian to have played in the Premier League era, according to you. Next week's show is a review of the 1994-95 season with two great comics. I've got Tony Cowards, who's an Ipswich Town fan. I've got Fran Jenkin, who is a Nottingham Forest fan. Two contrasting seasons for those two guys, and they talk about that and a lot more. Blackburn win the league, 4 teams go down. Man United win nothing for kind of like the first season in a few years, and the last time, I think, for a few years that happens as well, from memory. It's a really great season. Lots of off-the-field things happen. It's worth watching alone for Fran's recreation of the Seagulls Follow the Trawler press conference. Hello, fans. You want to be tuning in for that, let me tell you. But that's it for this week. Please subscribe. Please leave us a review. Share it with like-minded fans. I'd really, really appreciate it. I'm expecting lots of brand new people to the podcast who love Rob's book to be joining us this week. I'd really love it if you guys hung around. If you enjoy football from the 90s and kind of that nostalgic period of the early Premier League and Premiership years, you're going to love this show. So hang around, press subscribe and join me. And let's keep growing this football community. But that's it for this week. Join me next week again, 1994-95 with Fran and Tony. Until then, see you next week.
Thanks for listening to When Football Began Again. Join us again next time for another slice of Premier League nostalgia. In the meantime, subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, find us on socials, and spread the word with all your Premier League loving mates.